Hello, my name is Maria Paula Molano, and today I'm going to be talking about U.S. intervention in Colombia in the 20th century. So first I want to speak a little bit about the roots, why this relationship formed, how it formed. Since its independence in 1822, Colombia and the U.S. have always had a strong bond. They've always supported each other. The United States was actually one of the first countries to recognize Colombia and its autonomy. Colombia was actually, I think, one of the only countries, if not the only one, that backed the U.S. bombing of North Korea. Also, because of the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. was very involved in Latin America. This means that they were kind of policing over South America. This gave them a lot of power and control, and it made countries in South America be very reliant on the United States during World War II and afterwards. And also, in the wake of the Cold War, the U.S. absolutely needed, and it was a primary goal, to have democratic allies in South America. So I want to speak a little bit, before I go into U.S. intervention, the interest of the United States in the region. Why does a country choose to help another country? Is there any motives in the background, or are they just genuinely good? So, first off, it's a strategic Caribbean region. It's very well geographically located. It's also the 7th oil-producing country at the time, and it was believed to have 2.6 billion barrels of untapped petroleum, and about 10 times this amount in possible preserves. The United States also had invested a fruit company called the United Fruit Company, and interesting enough, in 1996, this was after helping Colombia and all these things, the United States created a lobbying effort to fund Plan Colombia, which we're going to talk about later on, and guess who funded this plan? It was Texaco, Enron, and BP, Occidental Petroleum, and other oil companies. And it was done to finance the U.S. intervention, as I mentioned before, a democratic ally. La violencia is a period of time of violence that occurred in Colombia between 1948 and 1957. To the bottom left, sorry, we can see a picture. It translates to the gringos put the warfare and Colombia puts the dead people. The reason that this was in one of the towns is because U.S. intervention meant that there was a lot of military aid. U.S. intervention meant that there were a lot of weapons, a lot of power going to Colombian officials, to the military, that wasn't very well trained and was very corrupt at the time. So, La violencia happened because civilians were very unhappy with the way that Colombia was treating its people. It was dislocating people, leaving them displaced. A majority of Colombian peasants did not have any farmland because the top 3% elite were the ones that took the land, were the ones that governed the land. And that left a lot of refugees, a lot of unhappy people, so they rose up and they created La Violencia. This was kind of the first time that Colombia called the United States and they asked for their help. From this, socialist paramilitary groups formed, and these were the groups that wanted to protect the peasants, wanted to protect the people. So they were protesting, they wanted to form a political party to have a word in these social changes. This period of time was terminated in 1957 by El Frente Nacional, which is the National Front, and it was basically an alternation between liberal parties and conservative every 4 years of presidents. I don't know if you guys have ever heard, but the FARC was the biggest guerrilla group in Colombia, and it was the biggest security threat to the Colombian government. It emerged in the early 1960s. This was actually right after La Violencia. And they were socialist Marxist-led. A very big misconception is that they were communists. The reason that they were painted this way is because Colombia needed the United States to fund them. They were not prepared for this type of group. They weren't prepared for all the social protests and all the needs for reform that the citizens were finally realizing that they had the right to. So what did they do? They called the U.S., they said, we have a communist threat, this is incredibly crucial to take care of. Of course, in the wake of the Cold War, the United States ran to their rescue. The FARC came together, actually, it formed because of a military offensive in the U.S. after La Violencia. The U.S., it was called Plan Lázaro, and they did a military offensive in some of the towns, and these people fled because they were insecure, they were unsafe, it was happening right at their front door. So they fled their homes. And when they fled, they all met up with each other. They were all angry, they were all young, and they wanted change. So they created the FARC in 1962. Another misconception misconception is that guerrillas were narco-guerrillas. This means that they were directly involved with cocaine production and other types of drugs, and that they were funded directly from drug production. While this came to be true later on, this was not the way that they were funded in the beginning, and it was not what their purpose was. It actually, the coca boom, the plant, it actually happened in Colombia after production in Bolivia and Peru lowered. This is a quote from one of the FARC members after years of trying to get a political position in the government. It states, "We are revolutionaries struggling for a change in regimen. We always wanted and struggled for this change for our people using the least painful means, throughout the democratic struggle for the masses, through the legal mechanisms spelled out in the Colombian Constitution. This path was closed to us, violently. And since we are revolutionaries that in one way or another are going to play the historic role that corresponds to us, we have been forced to find another way, the path of armed revolution for the struggle of power." This is, I found in a book by an author, Mauricio Murillo, and it's about the FARC. So why did they arm themselves? In Colombia, there was a lot of corruption, and even more so when the US began funding them. And this means that these groups didn't stand a chance if they were armed. They were going to be executed or just shut down. So another example of this is the M19. They got its name from the 19th of April. That was when Andres Pastrana, who was a president of Iran, robbed another candidate of his election. His name was General Rojas Pinilla, and this made them very angry. So they armed themselves. This is an example of a group that did not really have any purpose. It didn't have an end goal. It just wanted to get revenge. They went to the Supreme Court of Colombia, to the Palace of Justice, where the entire Supreme Court of Colombia suffered death or injuries. Afterwards, after realizing the severity of the issue, the Colombian president opted to create a peace negotiation with them, and before it was signed, ironically, they were all murdered. That was how it was eradicated. So the question is, was this a law enforcement issue or a deeply rooted social issue? The way that the Colombian government saw it was that their laws were not being taken seriously, and they needed to use force and violence to shut these groups down, and that they needed the US intervention for that. But that wasn't the case. I don't know if you guys have ever heard, but interchangeably they start using terrorist right after the Cold War because they want to label, they want to oversimplify issues that are not that easily oversimplified. Like Maple stated the other day, one man's terrorist is another man's savior, or something like that. So this makes sense for a lot of the peasants, a lot of the farmers. In these areas that were controlled by the FARC was viewed as their police, as their government, as their only protection from US intervention, from Colombian government officials trying to come and take their land, trying to come and basically just leave them in poverty. So President Kennedy authorized the Foreign Assistance Act in 1961, and that's when counterinsurgency tactics began being used. And Clinton's approval of Plan Colombia made Colombia become the third largest, recipient of the US military aid in the world. So here's the purpose of Plan Colombia. It was to create jobs, to combat the trafficking of drugs, negotiating peace, modernizing and restructuring the armed forces and police, strengthening human rights and justice movements, development for areas that would be affected by the eradication of coca crops. So here I have a couple of visuals. The first one to the left is a US airplane. It is doing what is called aerial fumigation. This was done with glyphosate. It's a very toxic, extremely poisonous chemical. And actually it's sold over the counter in the US, but it's much less concentrated than glyphosate, which is the one that they use in Colombia. It's called Roundup. It kills a lot of plants, and it's not at all compared to what they use over here. It was meant to eradicate the coca plants, but that's not what it did. And the US knew that, and Colombia knew that. What it did was kill all plants. It harmed animals, waterways, and humans. They gave them respiratory diseases and eye problems and much more. What happens when you're a farmer and you depend on your land to grow your food? And all of a sudden you go outside and they're spraying and they kill everything that you own. All of your land is no longer arable. What do? Well, you leave. You can't stay there because you can't survive. And now the US has a land where they can occupy. They did. They had 7 bases in all of Colombia, and one of actually the lands that was the most affected by aerial fumigation and the most people left was called Putumayo. This is where the most oil was in Colombia. So it's not very ironic that that happened. And Plan Colombia wanted to help human rights violations. The only thing this did was violate more. Another thing that this did was just create more of a relationship between the FARC and peasants. Because our government isn't doing anything to help us, so why should we side with them? Who else do we have? The FARC. With this, I want to speak about effectiveness of US assistance. The aerial fumigation, it just increased resentment between Colombian people and the government. It just made them want to uprise. This meant that more young adolescents were getting arms and trying to fight their government. Sadly, because of the quote that I read before, after years of trying to get a voice in the government, they gave up. They took arms. And they didn't have any funding. So they resorted to kidnapping people. They would kidnap politicians' daughters, sons, any way to get some type of recognition, to have some type of power. But that changed, and this was because of the US. So if the US had some positive effect, it was this. The US dismantled the Medellin cartel. That was the biggest enemy of the FARC at that time, because the Medellin cartel needed land to cultivate coca plants. So they would take the peasants' farms. They would go into FARC-led regions and take over. So when the US dismantled the Medellin cartel, they basically just got rid of the one enemy that the FARC had. What did this do? Well, this gave a lot of power to the FARC. They started cultivating coca plants in the land that Medellin cartel used to. And that's when their main source of income came from. So in a way, it was good. They stopped kidnapping people. But they're kidnapping people that they kidnapped annually, it was about 1,700 annually. But the amount of dislocated refugees that were left because of aerial fumigation was by far, far, much more. And after all, the aerial fumigation did not eradicate coca production. Colombia is still a very, very big coca producer. So it did not meet its incentive. It did not meet its goal. And lastly, it left displaced people. It cleared areas of oil fields so that they could grow their economic imperialism. To me, that I believe is devastating. It was, as we showed before in this picture, this is the way that I see it. The US had so much power over Colombia, and Colombia needed their power because they're corrupt, because they didn't want these forces to take over. They didn't want to change the way that their government was run. And the people that ended up suffering the most were the peasants. And it created a relationship that, until now, is still very difficult to mend. It created resentment, and the way that researchers have put it, if the US had wanted to help Colombia with the security, with human rights violations, with drugs, it would have negotiated peace deals. Because the reason that this happens is because there's no jobs, because there's poverty. And if they had wanted to help, they would have pushed towards peace deals. They didn't. They were all against that. Every time Colombia would put a peace negotiation on the table, they would be like, no. Because they needed this to keep happening. They needed a reason and an excuse to come into the country and be able to intervene, but not let it get out of their hands. Thank you.